Hi, this is my review of 1914, East Prussia, The World Undone, and is a folio game published by Conflict Simulations. So, first up, the rulebook, 16 pages, but that does include the cover and the contents and the back cover. Interestingly, the designer calls out that the game is very much inspired by the SPI classic of the Marne, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, by the late John Young. I grew up playing SPI games, and I have done a couple of videos on different SPI games on my channel. I have a lot of love for the old classic SPI games. The rules themselves are nicely laid out, as you can see. It's a nice large font, very easy and straightforward to read. The rules go through all the different mechanics of the game, and there are a few quite interesting mechanics. One of the things I'm going to call out straight away is the sequence of play. Is quite interesting in the sense that the Russian player and the German player both have two movement and combat phases. There's a little bit more to it than that, but basically the player can move in during those phases. The other thing that's interesting with this game, and I'll talk more about that when we have a look at the game on the board, is reserve movement. And reserve movement is you can use any unspent movement points for later in the turn. So if you don't use all your movement points in the first movement phase, you can. A certain number of units can use those in the second movement phase, which is quite unique. I can't think of many other games that do that, and it's super. It's an interesting mechanic. The game has zones of control, as you would expect. Rail movement is definitely a key feature of the game. Again, we'll have a look at that on the map in a short while. Combat is very straightforward. It's an odds-based system. You are comparing combat values to get your odds as you'd expect, and we'll have a look at the combat table. The combat table is quite interesting as well. I found reading the rules very straightforward. It is in wargaming terms, a fairly low-ish complexity game, I would describe. So when we get to page 8, remember the covers of the page and the contents of the page, we've pretty much read the majority of the rules. In terms of scenarios, I've played mostly the historical scenario, and the game details out which units go on which hexes for the board. You will need to check the errata. There are a couple of errors in the rulebook on the setup, so I highly recommend you do that. I found setting the game up the first time where those existed, I was like, that doesn't make any sense. So I went straight to Board Game Geek, and sure enough, it was cleared up for me. So no problem there. Again, as I said, very nicely laid out, very spacious. You also get a few different variants on the core scenario, and there is I'm not going to try and pronounce that word. There's just call it the Lakes battle as well, which I've enjoyed and played that. And then you're starting to get into the optional rules. And I would say, depending on the player you're playing against, the first time I played it, I just played the straightforward basic rules. And then we jumped into another game later using all the optional rules. And the optional rules added a lot. So some of these are technically classed as optional. I would highly recommend playing with some of these. In particular, I want to call out the hidden movement. That obviously doesn't lend itself well to... doesn't necessarily lend itself initially, as you might think, well to solitaire. And I'll talk about hidden movement when we have a look at the board. But there are a whole bunch of optional rules, specifically some around cavalry, which have a nice historical flavour, which I very much used. Forced marches, so you could have extra movement allowance, depending, certain circumstances depending. There are some very historical chrome additional rules, which I really enjoyed, and I really liked the attention to detail on the historical research that the game features. Then we get into the designer notes. These I very much enjoyed reading. It's always interesting to read the designer notes to understand what the designer's intent of the game is, to understand the sort of historical context of the game. And I thought these did a really, really great job of that. I would say that the rulebook, the sort of tone of the rulebook is really nicely written. It feels quite, what's the word? It feels like you understand what the designer's trying to get across, and it feels very personal. It's probably the best way I would describe it, and I really like that. It makes a nice sort of a warmth of tone to the rulebook that I thought was great. Now we're onto the back page now. I'm going to zoom the camera a little bit in, and we'll have a look at the CRTs. But basically, the back page is your player aid. I found playing the game very rare did I need to refer back to the rulebook. But I often kept the rulebook to hand for sure, mostly for the back page for the CRT. So let's have a look at those. So looking at those CRTs, there's two things I just want to sort of mention. One is there's a different CRT per, a unique CRT per side, so we've got the German, we've got the Russian. The other thing I want to call out is that it's very much a game of where the CRT will result in one side, generally speaking, retreating than the other side. And as the attacker, you are looking for quite, not surprisingly, due to the historical nature, very favourable odds. So if we have a look for the Russians, for example, and if we have a look at 1-to-1 odds, nearly every single one of those results would be the attacker retreating, unless you're using artillery and you get a very lucky die roll. 1-to-1, not advisable. If we look at 3-to-1, for example, we've got a result of 1, 2, or 3 resulting in the defender retreating, and then 4, 5, 6, and so forth with the attacker retreating. It's very much a game about pushing the opponent's counters back, and I really enjoyed that. It gives a sort of a nice movement to the game, and we'll have a look at the game. We'll talk about movement in a second, but yeah, very interesting CRTs, and I like that each side has its own CRT. Gives that sort of a more asymmetrical feel to the game, and very nicely laid out, very clear. Great job. So here's the game on the table. This is the historical scenario laid out, ready to start playing. The map, it's a paper map, and I've got it under some plexi here. I would describe the aesthetic of the map. It does have an old school, if that's the right term, SPI feel to it. And as I said, I grew up playing those sort of games, so it sort of has that tone and that feel. Very functional. It's very clear, the contents of the hex. And there aren't too many different types of terrain in this game for the hex, and for the most part, there's a lot of clear hex. We do have plenty of rivers. We do have some key fortress up the top of the map over there in Königsberg and so forth. And it's very clear. It's got a nice readability to the map, I would say. But it does have that sort of old school SPI charm. So if you're like me, you grew up playing those type of games, that's great. We'll have a closer look at some of the counters now. The counters themselves are not printed on card. They're printed on a sort of MDF type material, I would describe. And so they're a little bit more chunky than regular card type counters. And the contents of the counters are very clear. So you've only got a couple of attributes to the counter, sort of combat factor and then the movement factor. Very nicely done. There's different types of counters. Predominantly you've got infantry, and then artillery, and then we've got some cavalry over there. Using the sort of the optional rules for cavalry, they're not terribly effective, but combined with, as would suit the sort of historical context of the game, But yeah, I think the counters are very nicely done, and I quite like this sort of I think it's digital printing for them. It works really nicely. So in terms of the mechanics, this is a very straightforward game to learn and play. Movement, your counters show you your movement allowance. You have a terrain chart. You have that potentially double movement, and you potentially have this reserve movement. You can see from the board there's not a huge amount of counters, and there's a stack of counters in for reinforcements for later in the turns, but it's not a huge counter game. It is a game about movement, and you can see on the map hopefully two things. One is the train, track, rail routes, of which there are many that the German player can use, and the Russian player will be cutting those, and you get these nifty little rail cut counters. And I've had great fun playing two-player, cutting my opponent's rail routes for them, much to their dismay, as it impinges on their movement. And movement is what this game is one of the key features of the game I would describe. You also, your victory points are these key locations, of which there are many on the map, which gives you a great sense of scope for decision making. So victory points down at the bottom of the map here are worth sort of 1 point each, by and large, with the exception of a fortress over here that's worth a whacking 10 points. But as you progress up the map, they're worth more and more points. So, for example, right at the top here, in Königsberg, there are 25 points there. It's a fortress, so it's going to be difficult to take. But there are some nice, very tempting locations here that I can remember having some fun trying to get. That 10 points, 15 points, 10 points, for example. And part of the fun of the game, the enjoyment of the game, is that asymmetrical approach from both sides. So as the Russian player moving up, trying to capture these points, cutting the rail routes of the German player moving, they don't have anywhere near as many counters as you can see, and they have even less in reinforcements compared to the Russian player, trying to stop the Russian player from doing so. It's not a game about defeating or eliminating, by and large, you opposing stacks and counters. Most of the combat results don't result in a elimination, for example. It's about pushing them back, giving you space to maneuver. There's some interesting rules around combat and enemy zones of control, which is quite interesting. The actual combat's it's broad strokes. Combat's very straightforward. Every counter has an attack attribute and a movement attribute. That's all you need to worry about. There's some nice chrome about keeping these two Russian armies separate. And you simply compare the two combat values, and that gives you your odds. There's some modifiers based on the terrain, but it's very straightforward to learn, very straightforward to teach someone else to play. So yeah, in terms of mechanics, it's a straightforward, approachable, but with a great sense of how they lend themselves to the movement of the game. I'm going to talk about movement again in this game a lot. For me, that's one of the key things I took away from playing the game numerous times, is how important the movement. And it's important because you have to keep moving to take these objectives, and you have to keep stopping the opposing, if you're playing the Russians, stopping the German player from moving by cutting those rail lines. So some concluding thoughts, what I enjoyed about the game. I like the components. I like these slightly chunky counters. I like the fact they're double-sided and you can play the game with Fog of War. I thought that was quite interesting, and I added a lot to the two-player experience. I did play it solitaire against playing the Russians flipped over, so Fog of War, but playing the Germans open, and that was quite interesting. I think the game, you can play it solitaire. I think you're going to lose something in solitaire. I think, especially on the rail cutting the rail lines, I felt that was a better mechanic, or lent itself really nicely to two-player. and I had a lot of fun playing with my son as he was. We both played both sides, and he was rampaging around, cutting all my rail lines. In fact, I think he thought that was more fun actually than trying to take the objectives, which was good, and it was a fun gaming experience. So I like the components. I like the map. I like the old SPI games. I grew up playing those games. I have a lot of fondness for that style of war game, and it does have the whole game does have that sort of tone and vibe of a homage to